Hey everyone, and welcome back for a Thursday edition of Lunch Break Live with me, Ivana. And we are talking COVID today. I know that's shocking for all of you, but I am joined today by Dr. Nathan Erdmann. Now, Dr. Erdmann is working on the team that's overseeing the trial of Remdesivir at UAB. If you've kept up with Remdesivir or that trial, UAB is one of the test sites, and they have 16 patients of the about 440 worldwide. And UAB's done a lot of research with this. Dr. Erdmann, like I said, is on that team that's really worked hard to see Remdesivir, if it works, the effects that it has on patients, and they're just trying to figure out what is going to work to beat this virus. So, Dr. Erdmann, I know that you are a very busy man. I appreciate your time, and I know you told me before we went live that you're glad to do it because you want people to understand the drug and understand what's going on in our healthcare world right now with this. So
Yeah,
if
so I
you
mean,
go ahead. I know we have a little bit of a delay, so that can we can talk over each other sometimes. But I'm going to let you just take it from here, Dr. Erdmann. If you have, and for all of our viewers, if you have questions about Remdesivir or the trial that's happening at UAB, feel free to leave us a comment. I'll be checking my phone, and if there are any questions y'all have, I'll throw them to Dr. Erdmann. But Doctor, I'm going to let you just tell us a little bit about Remdesivir and about what's happening in this trial.
okay. So to your original point, yeah, I mean, we're working hard, but unless we have an ability to kind of convey what we know and what's happening in a meaningful way, it doesn't really matter. And with this being so new and so dynamic and frankly kind of hard to wrap your head around, that's an important job for people like us to try to get real information out there. Because, I mean, there's some bizarre stories out there and everything's moving so quickly, and trying to sort out what's real and what's noise is not a simple process. All right, so talking about Remdesivir or the ACTT trial. So if anyone has been paying attention, there have been a variety of different stories that have come out about different drugs, that they may be active, that they may be the answer, that they may be the next big thing to change the whole process. And while there's been lots of talk about that, a lot of the physicians have been pretty reserved as far as kind of weighing in on what those things meant. The reason being is that this is a new disease, and so we don't have an experience with them. So we can guess what may work, but until we test it in a definitive way, we can't really act upon that, at least not with a lot of confidence. So Remdesivir was identified very early on in this process because it is an antiviral that is known to work against RNA viruses in vitro, and it seemed to have some activity in model systems and in vitro, meaning just essentially a test tube, against viruses that are similar to COVID-19, like MERS and SARS. And so very, very early on, this was a focus as a target of something that needed to be tested as soon as possible to give us some tool to use. So even before we had cases in the United States, this was being something that was looked at as far as how it could be scaled up. And that's where some original data came out of China, because they were a little bit ahead of us as far as cases and trying the drug. And that study resulted a couple of weeks ago in a Lancet publication, which showed that there wasn't any benefit. Now, it wasn't that the drug didn't work. They couldn't see a signal that it did or did not work because there weren't enough participants in it. And so that wasn't negative data. It just wasn't positive data. We just didn't know how to interpret that. So this study that we've been involved in is unique because it's so early in the setting of COVID-19, but it was controlled in a way that would give us definitive answers. Meaning we didn't just give a bunch of people drug and look to see if we thought it worked. We controlled to see if it worked. So anyone who got in this study, I did not know, my team did not know, and the patient didn't know whether they got Remdesivir or they got placebo, meaning we just gave them a little bit of salt water. And so then we spent the next weeks enrolling people into the study and then capturing every little bit of information about what did and didn't happen, entering all that information in very elaborate and painful spreadsheets, and then send that off to the NIH. And then they accumulated all that data. And then somewhat abruptly, we found out that there was signal coming from the study, and we did not know what that signal was, but we all got on a call. And I will tell you, I was worried that we were going to find out that there was safety data suggesting that maybe the drug was causing some sort of harm, because again, that's what we're testing. But we found out that even before we anticipated getting a result, was that those that were receiving Remdesivir were doing better than those that received the salt water, which is certainly what we would have hoped, and it actually beat our expectations as far as timing a little bit. So to interpret the study and what we know so far, is that we've enrolled 1,063 participants across dozens of sites, mostly in the US, but also some globally. We do not have the data on all those 1,000. I still have people in the hospital right now at UAB that are on study that have not completed their full kind of study portion. And then we have other patients that have left the hospital and are now coming to the outpatient setting to collect final data. But of those 1,000, 4 of them actually completed or had outcomes. And those outcomes were then tabulated and evaluated and showed that there was a statistical difference, meaning those that got placebo were now different than those that got remdesivir. And the numbers that are kind of quoted to that is that it looked like there was a 30% reduction in timing to improvement of illness. And there's a suggestion that there's a change in mortality. Although when we do the statistical analysis, it falls just out the window of what we would call kind of statistically significant. That said, I'm relatively optimistic that that data will get sorted out a bit more as we get more of those 1,000 that they kind of progress through the study. And so we capture more of them. And we're certainly optimistic that we'll find a firmer signal as opposed to a more diffuse signal as that results.
Well, and that's so interesting. And just to give people a little bit of an idea of that data that you're kind of talking about, this was from about 2 weeks ago. So this is ever changing.
All right, Ivana, I'm not hearing you right now.
Uh-oh. Let's see. Doctor, can you hear me now? Looks like we might have some issues with the doctor hearing me. We're going to try to get him back. But while he is working to get his sound back, I'll go over some of this preliminary data that we have talked about that Dr. Erdmann was just mentioning. So of these 400 to 500 patients that were enrolled in the study about 2 weeks ago, that data showed that 8% of those people who received the drug died, compared with an 11% on placebo. And while that number sounds a little bit low or maybe a small margin, that's actually a pretty big margin in research and in medicine, according to the doctor. He also said that I don't know if y'all heard a few minutes ago, but he said that these patients recovered 31% faster than those who got the placebo, which was about a saltwater solution. So that's a big deal in research, according to the doctor. He's texting me now to make sure he can get back on. Sorry, guys, I'm trying to get him back for you. But that is some data that he has been able to read from that trial. Now, again, that trial is it's still happening, and this is data that is still being formed. This was from about 2 weeks ago, and so the numbers that are going to come out hopefully later this month in May, those will be different probably. But that's what we know so far about the remdesivir. Now, at UAB, the doctor said they have 16 patients here in this trial. Now, that seems a little bit low for a trial. I agree. That's what I said when we've talked before going on air. But something that the doctor told me is to keep in mind these numbers, these percentage numbers about the 31% faster recovery than those with the placebo, that comes from the full study. That's not just of the 16 at UAB. That comes from the 400 to 500 patients that are enrolled in the trials worldwide. So just something to think about and to remember when those numbers seem a little bit low. Doctor, can you hear me now? Perfect. I can, yes, sir. So I have the doctor back. Doctor, I was just going over a little bit of this this data that you and I were talking about, and that you were mentioning about the 31% faster recovery, and how that might seem a little bit low to the layman, but that's pretty significant in the terms of research and medicine. Can you speak at all on that?
Yeah, so 30% sounds a little bit puny kind of on first sniff, but the way that is in practice is that means 1 out of every 3 people that we gave the study drug to in a blinded fashion, which was remdesivir, versus those we gave saltwater to, had a improvement versus if they wouldn't have gotten drug. So 1 out of 3 being with an observable difference is pretty compelling, especially when this trial was targeted for people that had pretty severe disease already. And one of our concerns going in was that, are we giving this drug in an early enough time frame of the disease process to make enough benefit to really see something? Because as we've talked about, it's an antiviral, meaning it targets the virus itself as opposed to the body's response to the virus, which causes a lot of the respiratory problems that we observe later.
That's a good point, and I believe that I read, and tell me if I'm wrong, but this drug a lot of times was started giving to patients that were already on ventilators.
Right. So the way the study was written is that you had to be hospitalized, which by definition means that you're already relatively sick. And then to qualify, you had to have a respiratory syndrome or hypoxia to some degree. And that wasn't restricted to ventilators. We have some studies that are starting to target that population specifically, but it ended up having a bias for people that were pretty well along in their presentation. And one of the things that's been fascinating and scary about this disease process is that we have a lot of people that get infected that don't really feel well, have cough, maybe some fever, but that they do okay at home. Then we'd have a population of people that would come in and are clearly progressing from cough to really having some shortness of breath. And when this study was really kind of busily enrolling, and that we were just kind of having our initial wave here in Birmingham, we had multiple floors full of people in the hospital, and most of them would kind of have their cough and fever but start feeling better in a couple days. But then without really much ability to predict who was who, some would very quickly decompensate and end up getting intubated very quickly. And that's what's been scary about this. And one of the things that we're hoping to learn on the research that's kind of corroborating what's happening with the studies is, what the heck is that about? How can we predict who's more likely to have those problems? And what is the disease doing to target certain people? This is where some of the information has come about. Those with hypertension, those from certain demographics that we're learning seem to be more susceptible to worse outcomes.
And let me ask you a question about that before I take some of these questions. But first, let me ask you when you say that some of these, like we were talking about, this drug was given a little bit later, maybe when people were already pretty sick and in the hospital. Are there any studies right now that are being used to give that drug to patients that are maybe just getting diagnosed?
Good question. So the drug right now, it's only in an IV formulation. So it means you have to have a piece of plastic stuck in your arm or someplace else that I can give you the drug. And there's also logistics of getting the drug and access to it quickly. And so right now it's purely a hospital intervention. Something we've talked about with the people on the drug development side is that it's not impossible to envision converting this over to something that's a little bit more readily available in pill form, but that's not going to be a simple process. I mean, it's worth considering that this disease didn't exist before November of 2019 anywhere in the world, and only made its way over to the United States probably in January into February. And yet here we are still in the spring talking about a drug that we've now proven works in people with this brand new infection. So we are way ahead of the curve of where we would have typically been, and yet we all realize that we're still behind. And so trying to figure out what we can do to kind of make progress. So to a roundabout way to getting back to your question, there's ongoing interest as far as trying to identify people that would make sense to treat as early as possible, but yet our hands are tied somewhat as far as getting people in the community right as they might get exposed.
So, good question from Jill, and something that I wanted to ask you. This the cost. I know right now we have one manufacturer that is making this drug. Does that drive up the cost? Yep. And if so, is this something that is going to only be a treatment for people who can afford it?
So that is not a small question. It is going to be amazingly messy because pharmaceutical drug development and delivery is no doubt an expensive process. And there's all sorts of things that go into drug costs. Some of them are like built into the development side, the research side, and some of it go into bottom line for big for-profit companies. And it's not really their fault. Their job is to help benefit people, but really to make money for their shareholders. And I'm not really in a position to behold that against them. So it's going to be messy. And then the other part about this is that there's going to be, can you imagine a more politicized and highly visible situation? So Gilead has some challenges as far as trying to figure out how to do this well. As people know, that there's the clinical trial, there's something called compassionate use, where we've been able to request small doses of the drug from the company directly. And now there's the emergency authorization that has just come through. And sites were recently selected for that. And there was a handful of sites that were selected, and there was a whole lot of sites that weren't. And we on the provider side don't yet fully understand how those decisions were made and what the process is and what's coming next. some of this isn't really their fault, again, because it's new and there's lots of moving parts. I get that. And yet we want the drug. We want to be able to help people as much as we can, as fast as we can. And so communication and being upfront about what is and isn't happening is pretty important to this process working well. But we're going to have some patience.
What patients are getting priority to get this drug right now?
Well, right now, the people that are getting priority are people that have a mechanism to get access. So there's only a few places that have been actively enrolling people for Remdesivir, particularly in our region, because somewhat beneficially, we've been a little bit late compared to some of the coastal expansions of the disease. Right now, we are only enrolling people in study and for people that qualify for a certain kind of set of parameters. Although at this particular moment, we're waiting for kind of the next arm of the study to open up and to get additional access to drugs. We have a very, very limited supply. So priority is just becoming a function of when we have drug and who seems to fit the criteria as far as their disease process and also their laboratories, so that we can know that they're most likely to be safely able to tolerate the drug.
Now, talking about that, and we know that right now Gilead is the person who is making, or the company rather, that is making this drug. It doesn't seem like there could be enough for everybody that would need it. I know the FDA has granted emergency use for the treatment of COVID right now using Remdesivir, but even with just that emergency use bar, is there enough for that?
I mean, the short answer is no, not in the near term. And there's tremendous logistical challenges and efforts that are going to need to be put in place to try to change that. I am not a chemist and not on the pharmaceutical side of things, although I get to observe it, so I have some insight. But there's a lot of challenges there that need to be worked out. And as much as we would like, now that we think we have something that's effective, to be able to snap our fingers and be able to provide it to everyone that would have benefit, that's just not logistically possible. The problem is that we need to accelerate the system as aggressively as we can to still have a safe product and get that to as many people as possible that need it. There's people right now in Alabama that would likely benefit from the drug, and yet me is kind of as close as we can get to kind of getting access to the drug. I can't provide it for them yet. And that's not anyone's fault. It's just what we have to be focused on kind of as a system to try and figure out how to make this work as efficiently as possible.
Is that something that could be solved by maybe other companies being able to produce this drug? Or is that something that we are waiting on the FDA for to approve wider use?
Right. So we have the breaking news that the FDA has kind of given this early authorization. I can't speak with any authority as far as what the manufacturing capacity is or isn't. And rescaling a factory to kind of make a new product isn't something that can, again, happen with the snap of a finger. It's possible, but it takes some time. And all this needs to be done in a way that you and I and everyone else knows exactly what's coming in these vials. So there's a lot of quality control that goes into this as well. So it is not a simple process, and these are massive companies that have huge infrastructure in place to be able to do this, but yet we're demanding a lot of them to have this happen so quickly. It's similar to what's happening on the vaccine side of things. We do this, but this is something that usually occurs over years as opposed to weeks to months to try to kind of push these studies through.
And kind of jumping off of that, I have a good comment again from Jill. Do you think that, and this is just going off of her comment, do you think that politics is playing a big part in this battle? I know that you and most other medical professionals are just trying to make the drug, treat patients, etc. But do you think that the development of this drug or the push for a vaccine is being affected by politics?
I mean, it's being affected. How is harder to say. The Remdesivir specifically, it's such a dynamic topic right now because of how it's changing. Before, I would feel much more comfortable weighing in what was political and what wasn't, because there were clearly an agenda to try to be able to show that there was something to do and that maybe Plaquenil was the answer, and trying to point at something outweighed what was not known and what was and wasn't understood. And I feel like a lot of us in the medical profession were very uncomfortable with how much pressure was being put on a drug that we didn't have a whole lot of confidence in. Remember, the evidence for the hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil was based on under 30 patients in multiple conditions. So it was like down to 5 patients that had shown maybe some benefit. And even that report, there were some concerns about what the quality of the data was. And I mean, even the people that were skeptical, me included, were not saying that we don't want to learn more. We just weren't to act upon that and say that that's clear evidence, then we should go ahead and proceed. Because I tell my patients all the time, I don't want to give you anything unless I have to. And when I do have to give it to you, I want to be able to know what to anticipate. And that's stuff that we treat all the time. We have a frame of reference for. This is all new. And so it takes some calculus to kind of get to the point where we're comfortable to knowing what we are doing, what we aren't doing, and make sure we're helping people and not hurt people. So politics influences this, infrastructure influences this. The timing of everything makes it more complicated because while these questions are not new, having to answer them as quickly as we're having to and having such massive impact for each change in course is more pressure than the system is used to. There's ways to get around that to some degree. Like the fact that we're having this type of outbreak is not shocking to people in this field. Like this has happened before, it just hasn't kind of happened to this scale yet. And it's gonna happen again. So we can either build in infrastructure in place to be more responsive to this type of threat, or we can be stuck in a position of reacting and scrambling and make it work as best we can, but with a lot of limitations.
Do you believe, or would you feel comfortable saying or agreeing with the statement that remdesivir could be the miracle treatment?
I would not agree with that statement. I have a lot of confidence in the data we have so far and the way the study has been conducted to suggest that remdesivir is going to have benefit for a good chunk of patients that end up getting COVID, at least more severe presentations of that disease. But I do not believe, from what I've seen thus far, that this is going to be something that single-handedly repositions the outbreak and changes what's happening on a larger scale. So it doesn't strike me as that. If for no other reason, because we're stuck with an IV formulation that can only be delivered to people that have more severe illness, and it's already, there's already going to be disruption just based upon that. But the hope is that getting access to the drug on a broad scale will be able to help influence the number of deaths and severe outcomes that we're seeing with the infection. And that alone would be a huge change in the calculus of the whole overall outbreak. But no, this is not something that I see is going to fundamentally change everything in the very near term.
And just, I promise, one of my final questions, I know you're busy. I think that it was interesting, something I read, I don't remember if it was in a UAB release, if it was from our website or somebody else, but it was talking about this cocktail of drugs that is often used. Cocktails of drugs are used for a lot of different things, and what I mean by that is a combination of several different drugs or several different substances. So do you think that maybe there's some sort of cocktail or combination of drugs that will be used in conjunction with remdesivir for patients with COVID, or are we looking right now at purely remdesivir to treat?
All right, so a lot of layers in that onion there, but I'm happy to kind of dig into it. It's not. It's a perfectly fair question, but it's a very, very complicated answer. The short term is that remdesivir is not a one and done. It's actually the opposite. It's a signal to show that attacking the virus in this way has benefit. Now there's all sorts of various ways to optimize that we can make progress with that further. There is the opportunity to be able to target the virus in multiple ways using some sort of cocktail that's specifically targeting the virus. Although where we're going next, at least in the setting kind of the remdesivir studies, is continuing to target the antiviral component with remdesivir, but then adding on something that will help hopefully modify the immune system in a beneficial way. Because part of the presentation of COVID is not just the viral damage, but the massive inflammatory response that the virus generates, particularly in the lungs, and all the damage that goes along with that. And so one of the theories very, very early on has been that, well, whether we control the virus or not, if we can perhaps modify the immune system in a beneficial way, that will help people dramatically have less complications. And so I'm far more enthusiastic about that approach now that we have an ability to affect the virus directly Because part of the concern is that you take a viral infection, but then you pull back the immune system. You're kind of fighting two ends here because you may allow the virus to kind of persist or get a more head of steam that could cause more damage. So now that we have something that can target the virus, we are in a better position to be able to try to modify the immune system to try to help the disease process in a couple different ways. But going downstream of what remdesivir is, now that we know that that's a reasonable target, there's all sorts of ways that you could target the virus specifically using remdesivir as a template. There's likely a lot of different ways that can be done. Not unlike what's been done with HIV, where we have a couple approaches that were identified to have benefit, and you start packaging the chemistry to make that work in a slightly different way, and you combine them in a way that's more effective. Part of the reason HIV is such a challenge is because it's a moving target. The way the virus copies and moves makes it much more difficult to use a vaccine or therapies for. And it looks like there's the possibility COVID-19 may have some degree of that, where it may change some, but nothing near the scale of what HIV does. So it's going to be more of a fixed target. It's just that it's a more abrupt process that really puts a lot of pressure on us to come up with something quickly and have a quick intervention. More layers to that question if you want to dig into it, but yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, when you talk about this, it is, you talk about how this has been a quick development, or you have to make quick developments, you have to make quick decisions, things like that, because of this outbreak. Now, something I heard you mention earlier, and I think it requires a follow-up, is that you said we shouldn't be surprised as a country, as a world, that we are in this pandemic right now, and you said that this will happen again.
Mm-hmm. This particular type of virus, it's made jumps into
humans. I have to laugh because you're just like, yeah, of course it will.
Yeah. So I lecture high school students, and one of the questions I like to pose to these high school students is, all right, we're going to talk about a bunch of different viruses, a bunch of different diseases, and let's use the delivery of your Amazon package as an output for what this outbreak could look like. And so then let's talk about Ebola. Is Ebola going to keep you from getting your Amazon package? And then is seasonal influenza going to keep you from getting your Amazon package? And then start talking about other stuff. And we would talk about different viruses and what likely scenarios are to come. And this type of scenario with this type of organism is not a shocking development. I mean, this is something that was entirely predictable to a degree, like any semi-unpredictable event, but we know it's going to happen at some frequency, and that's just the nature of this. And it doesn't require an elaborate explanation. It's just that viruses are messy organisms. You put viruses and humans and other animals together, every once in a while they kind of recombine and make a jump. And for coronaviruses, this has happened with SARS and MERS and now COVID, all within this century. And by century, I mean since 2000. So it will happen again. Whether it gets this broad and is quite this way, it won't be. It'll be a little bit different. And I mean, we always worry about influenzas because it's more than capable of doing something like this as well. So either, getting to our earlier point, either we kind of accept that reality and build an infrastructure so that we're in a position to respond to it quickly, or we're stuck kind of scrambling when it does happen.
Do you think, I have two more questions for you. One, you mentioned the flu, and I know this year everybody said we had such a bad flu season. And another thing I heard you mention earlier was that you think COVID came to the U.S. maybe in January, as early as January. Do you think some of these people that believed that they had the flu or maybe even were diagnosed with the flu could have had COVID?
The broad answer, it's possible, but in the vast minority of cases. So while there were a handful of cases that started traveling out of China across the world, perhaps maybe a handful of cases in December, but this started happening in January. And then there is pretty clear evidence that there were cases that weren't really being diagnosed in February in certain places across the world, but also in the United States. That said, we had a lot of flu going on, and a lot of flu looks like a lot of COVID infection. And for the vast majority of people, the influenza is a far more likely explanation. We're hoping to get some better kind of understanding of this as we get better antibody-based tests. We have a clear idea of who does and does not have antibody to COVID, but that process isn't particularly simple either, because you and I have both almost certainly had coronavirus. it was just seasonal coronavirus that's been passed around as kind of upper respiratory infections for years. And you need a good enough test that can tell you it was definitely coronavirus, but definitely not that coronavirus. And so that takes a little bit of time to get a test that's kind of clean enough to be able to differentiate that. That's something that's going to come. It's not that technically difficult, but it doesn't happen instantaneously. And so that needs to be done. That's where there's a lot of noise coming from the various antibody tests that are out there, as they're trying to get that more refined. And so we can have a better understanding of truly who was positive, who wasn't. But for the vast majority of the people kind of watching us right now, unless they were sitting in airports traveling the world January into early February, the likelihood is functionally zero. And there are a handful of people that had pretty high probability encounters based upon people that eventually became positive later, or that they knew that they were traveling through areas that had some cases that maybe make sense in February. But for the vast majority of us, particularly regionally, this is something that really didn't become a thing well into March.
That's fascinating, and it's scary and fascinating at the same time, which I imagine a lot of your work is. If just to wrap up, I know that this trial is still happening. When is this trial for Remdesivir set to end, and when do we expect to have more information about the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of the drug?
Okay, cool. So one of the fun parts about this study is that it was specifically designed to not have a one question. So we just completed phase 1, and we completed enrollment for phase 1. And that was initially targeted at a minimum of 400 participants and ended up going to 1,000. And so, like I said in the beginning, we still have the tail end of this study is still wrapping up. We're still capturing data. And we should have updates as far as those numbers we talked about early later this month. And we should kind of get some iterative updates as far as the outcomes and as they become a little bit more clear. And then we'll have all sorts of more granular data on the overall data set once it all completes and we're able to put it together and publish that. We're now actively preparing for phase 2. We thought that was going to open already, but we got all messed up because we found out the drug actually works. And so we had to recalibrate the study. And so we're repackaging that. So now we view it's essentially unethical to have a saltwater arm, that now that we know Remdesivir has some benefit, we need to compare things to Remdesivir. And so that's required some new logistical changes to make the study appropriate now that we have the information available. So we're expecting to open what we're calling phase 2 of this study imminently. Because it's been such a dynamic process, it wouldn't shock me if we got a message tonight that we're getting ready to open in the next few days, but it may be another week or so as we try to get all the logistical bureaucratic stuff in place. But that's coming imminently. And then the intent is to keep kind of getting back to your earlier question, is keep trying to add on to what we know and then kind of accentuating that to try to keep improving our potential interventions, so we have a better control on what the disease process is and how best to influence it for improved outcomes for our patients.
That we will be sure to be looking for information on, more information later this month, and then also the beginning of phase 2. We would love to have you back explaining some of this. We appreciate all of your straight shooting answers and also very layman's answers, as we talked about earlier. So, Doctor, thank you so much. You have given us so much of your time, and I appreciate it. And I'm sure all of our viewers do as well. So thanks again, Doctor. And for all of you watching, if you have any other questions for the doctor, please let me know. I'll do my best to get them to him. And for everybody else, we will see you tomorrow.